Hello, everybody. Welcome, welcome, welcome to the fourth day of our Hess Scholar in Residence Week with Lisa Lowe. My name is Lauren Mancia, and I'm a professor in the History Department at Brooklyn College and the Wolf Faculty Associate this academic year. Welcome to Before 1492 Comparative Premodern Colonialisms. So before we begin, I just want to acknowledge that Brooklyn College is a college that sits on the traditional and unceded territory stolen from the Canarsie and the Nyack, subgroups of the Lenape people. And that ongoing theft, along with the stolen blood and work of enslaved Africans, enables our presence today. Today, we're going to talk about the pre-modern history of settler colonialism. This means the form of colonialism that seeks to replace indigenous populations with an invasive settler society that over time develops a distinctive identity and sovereignty. We often think about imperialism and colonialism as phenomena that happened in the world after 1500 CE as a result of European exploration, but it was also a phenomenon present before the early modern period in the pre-modern world. So how does such pre-modern history both deepen our understanding of colonialism and modernity and enhance our understanding of the world before European hegemony? That's what our panel is going to discuss today. So each of our speakers will speak for 8 to 10 minutes, and then after they speak, we'll open the floor to questions, comments, and conversation until we end right at 10:45 a.m. So without further ado, I want to introduce our first speaker, Professor Brian Sowers, who's Assistant Professor of Classics at Brooklyn.
Thank you, Professor Mancia. I'm really excited to be here. Thank you all for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us. I am going to attempt to cover ancient Mediterranean colonialisms. That's a huge topic, all within 8 minutes, not a minute over 10 minutes. And I've divided this, just for convenience sake, into 4 categories. So the first one is Phoenician colonialism, then 2 parts of Greek colonialism, what is known as classical Greek colonialism, and then the colonization program that was started by Alexander the Great and his successors. That'll be the 3rd part. And then I'll end by talking about Roman colonialism. I want to begin, I'll use some terms, various types of colonialisms, maybe some typologies, and I am following Nancy Shoemaker's work when I use those terms. Okay, so let's jump right in. I apologize for this infographic in that it uses colors that might be difficult for some of us to distinguish. I'll use my cursor to sort of orient us. So I want to begin with the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians are Semitic peoples in the eastern part of the Mediterranean. They're seafaring people. By the end of the first, or at the start of the first millennium, they're the dominant naval power, seafaring people in the Mediterranean. And in order to expand their trade networks, they, in the 9th century BCE, begin to send out colonies. Their colonies are, for the most part, along the coasts. We can see a few. This is sort of indicated in red, little Cyprus, a couple of the islands in the Mediterranean, but their most sort of famous one is in North Africa, modern day Tunisia, the colony of Carthage, which grows in power and influence and then starts to send out its own colonies across, as you can see here, the coast of North Africa, in mostly in what is modern day Morocco and Tunisia, although elsewhere. And then you can see as well, they start to send out colonies in what is southern Spain. And they're doing this within the course of a couple of centuries. The Spanish colonies are, even though they are securing the trade networks, this is also intended to extract resources to enrich Carthage itself. So this would be a separate typology following Shoemaker, what she describes as extractive colonialism. where they are primarily interested in the silver veins that are there in southern Spain. Um, um, Carthage, as a result, Carthage becomes unbelievably wealthy, and that only increases their sphere of influence in the western part of the Mediterranean. At the same time that the Phoenicians are beginning their colonialist program, the Greek city-states located here, so what is modern day Greece, as well as the western coast of modern day Turkey, these city-states are then sending out their own colonies or establishing their own colonies as to extend their trade networks. We can see this along the Black Sea coast, along with some of the other islands, including the island of Sicily, very famous colony of Syracuse is there. The tip of the boot of Italy. So many colonies were established here in southern Italy that this area was known as Magna Graecia, Greater Greece, along with some in what is modern day southern France and even in Spain, to try to access the silver veins that are there. So like the Phoenicians, the Greeks are using their colonies primarily to secure trade networks, but also the second type of colonialization that they engage in is what it's my favorite of Shoemaker's typologies, what she refers to as "not in my backyard" colonialism, which is to say, as a result of internal political conflicts in cities, the losing factions would oftentimes be exiled, sent out of their city, and they would go and found a colony that would have some relationship with the mother city or the mother land. So those are the two types. With the rise of Alexander the Great, let me move to my next. Oh, 1 second. Let me actually go to this map. We can see this kind of nicer, and I'll zoom in. You can see in red, these city-states are the ones that are primarily the colonizing Greek city-states, and they are founding a series of colonies here on the map. It's important to note, for those of us who are less familiar with Greek culture, that this is the Greek culture at this time is not a nation. These are individual city-states. So that each colony would be loyal to some degree to the city that founded them, and oftentimes hostile to almost every other Greek city-state, especially the ones that were not allied with their founding city. With Alexander the Great in 334, we see a massive shift in the way that the Greeks are engaged in colonization. So Alexander's father, Philip II, these folk are from Macedon, area north of Greece proper, had already conquered the Greeks and forced them to unify, which the Greeks resented quite vocally. And then Alexander follows in his father's footsteps by invading the Persian Empire. This is a massive empire that had controlled modern day Turkey, Egypt, and most of the Middle East. And in rapid succession, Alexander wins a series of battles, conquering down through modern day Turkey, through the Levant, into Egypt, where he is declared a god, up through Mesopotamia, and then he continues his march further east, getting all the way to the Indus River. So he marches through modern day Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan. Along the way, one of the things that he does is he decides to establish colonies, where he's like, and he names them all Alexandria after himself, and there are some 30 of them. He never took the time to actually build them. He was just like an Alexandria here, an Alexandria there an Alexandria here an Alexandria. Along his march, eventually his soldiers are like, we are not marching any further, we have to go back. He returns to Babylon, where he dies quite young. So these colonies, some of them are established, most famously the one in Egypt. Alexandria becomes the second largest city in the Mediterranean, and really the most important city on the eastern half of the Mediterranean for sure. And then others, especially those, as you can see out here in the West, that some of them are established, but then others we know nothing about. We don't know where they were located or if they were ever actually founded as colonies. But this is self-evidently from this map, Alexander's attempt to engage in imperialist control. So he's using these colonies or planning to use these colonies to maintain control of this vast real estate that he has conquered quite quickly. Now, after he dies, his generals divide this newly conquered land among themselves, and they then continue Alexander's program of setting up colonies. This is all still what Shoemaker would describe as imperial power colonialism. And we can see here with this infographic a couple of things. One, all of the ones that are out here further east are originally established by Alexander himself. The successors of Alexander effectively abandon everything further east. They're not able to control it, and they are using the colonies that they found, which they name after themselves. So there might be a couple new Alexandrias, but most of them are Antioch, Seleucia, Berenike, Ptolemais. They name them after themselves or maybe their parents. They're using them as a mechanism to compete with each other. So as you can see in the infographic, the vast majority of the colonies are here in the Levant, because that's the edge of the territories of the Ptolemaic kingdom here in Egypt and the Seleucid kingdom up here in modern day Turkey and Mesopotamia. So as they are competing and trying to defeat each other, they establish colonies on the contested land. There are modern proliferations of this. I'm sort of like setting stages for further conversation for us to have. And I can see that I'm already having to wrap up. So I want to sort of turn very quickly to the Romans. So because imperial power colonialism was fully established in the East by Alexander and his successors, the Romans just co-opted that when they start to subsume the eastern part, but they earlier on, as they're trying to control the western part of the Mediterranean, they are using colonialism as the mechanism for doing such. As you can see in this infographic, it looks like the vast majority, and this is true, the vast majority of Roman colonies are in Italy, because the earliest period as Rome is expanding and subsuming the other Latin peoples in Italy into their imperialist control, they are creating colonial relationships with them. That's the first stage of Roman colonization. The second one begins in the 2nd century as the landless poor in Italy start to mobilize their voice to demand recognition. And a number of movements at the end of the 2nd century they send out colonies to give the landless Roman poor land. And they're doing this some in Italy, but then also to the northern part. The third stage, as you can see most clearly from the infographic, is to control the areas that they are attempting to expand their empire toward. So we can see in modern day Britain, we can see that they are doing this in modern day France, Belgium, Holland, Spain, including Greece. But it's worth noting that they particularly established colonies alongside the Rhine and the Danube rivers as a way of securing these natural boundaries to the empire. It does not work if you know sort of your later Roman history. And most of these colonies are being settled. The settlers are retired soldiers who are presumably going to be loyal to the Romans and enforce Roman hegemonic interests in these areas. Okay, so I know that was a rapid survey. Thank you so much for your time and attention and for allowing me to be here.
Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Sowers. We're now going to move on to Professor Lynda Day, who is Professor of Africana Studies at Brooklyn College.
Hello, welcome to Professor Lowe, first of all. And then, of course, greetings to everyone who's on the Zoom meeting this morning. I took a definition of settler colonialism from Professor Lowe's index. And so from my perspective, if settler colonialism means genocide, appropriation of land, forced taxation, racial segregation, and coerced labor to create capitalist profit for an alien ruling class, then settler colonialism in pre-modern Africa did not exist. However, in this presentation, I would like to discuss some examples of expansion, conquest, cultural domination, and empire building in pre-modern Africa, all of which did exist. First of all, I'd like to discuss and describe Bantu expansion and Nilotic migration, focusing on the example of the Tutsi, Hutu, and Twa people of East Central Africa from the 14th to the 17th centuries. And secondly, feudal system of empire building, focusing on the Empire of Mali, dated from 1235 to 1400 CE. My slides are not advancing. Let's see. Yes. So Bantu expansion was a major force in the settlement of Southern and Eastern Africa. Most everyone understands that there were people already there. There were people who were foragers and hunter-gatherers, but over the course of several millennia, people speaking Proto-Bantu languages migrated out of their original homeland and over many generations absorbed and dominated Cushitic or Khoisan-speaking people who were the indigents of vast areas of Southern and Eastern Africa. Since at least the 1400s, Bantu languages have been predominant languages in these areas. So how did Bantu speakers come to dominate these regions? Most historians and archaeologists link such domination to the Jared Diamond theory of farmer power, in that people who were efficient agriculturalists, who brought with them new crops and farming techniques, could produce larger populations and thus overpower indigenous farmers and indigenous foragers and hunter-gatherers simply by overwhelming them with greater numbers. And besides their farming skills, the people of some of the Bantu people also brought with them cattle, to which was a big innovation for that region. This is the land that they had to cross and move into. As you can see, it's got potentially very fertile land, and at the same time, no major barriers to movement. And where there were barriers, certain mountainous areas, certain swampy areas, certain types of forests, they went around them to find savanna regions like this. So these are the kinds of cattle that they brought with them, a very interesting and indigenous type of cattle for this area. But besides these valuable farming techniques and cattle that brought with them, I want to stress other practices that have been brought up to describe why it is that the Bantu speaking people also were able to come to dominate this region. So the ones that are usually brought up for example, the practice of lobola. Lobola means giving cattle to a woman's family to legally marry her. Furthermore, the widespread practice of polygamy, marrying many women, that resulted in a pattern of intermarriage between otherwise disparate groups, and which became avenues for social cohesion. It's been described that the lobola, the giving of cattle, was seen as very valuable for people who were foragers and hunter-gatherers, because people coming in would in effect give them wealth for the purpose of marrying their children. And the understanding was that it has been that they saw that as a win. The foraging people who were there already saw this as a win, that they would be given cattle for the purposes of marrying their daughters. So age sets as well, which were initiation societies in a way, but that initiated people of a certain age in a district. And these age sets were given responsibilities and duties, which they maintained over the lifespan of the group. And so they had the mechanisms of of forming these age sets into cohesive groups. And these cohesive groups were there, and they did not depend on family, they did not depend on clan or language. So the example that I wanted to specifically raise in this kind of migration pattern is the example of the Tutsi, Hutu, and Twa. The in-migrating Tutsi were probably of Nilotic stock. They brought with them cattle. Bantu people, the Hutu, were already there and were farmers. And the Twa people, people of the forest, who were indigenous, probably the early and original indigents of this region. But all reports are that these three groups began to function as a prosperous society without forced assimilation, without land appropriation, without genocide. And indeed, the term Tutsi in Kinyarwanda means cattle keepers. And by all accounts, a symbiotic relationship arose between the Hutu farmers that were in the fertile valleys, the Tutsi cattle keepers on the drier highlands, the Twa people in the forest. The Tutsi provided milk and meat, the Hutu provided agricultural products, and the Twa provided wild game and honey. The royal families of the Tutsi married Hutu women. Again, this marriage pattern which made their children part of the Tutsi clans, thus providing social mobility between the groups. Since records have been kept, the two groups have certainly maintained a type of social cohesion, but they speak the same language and they share many social customs. The Twa people of the forest were always expected to participate in certain religious rituals because there was an acceptance and understanding that they were the spiritual inheritors of the land. So certain religious rites that either the Tutsi or Hutu engaged in required their participation. So this was a way that these three groups managed to forge themselves into a single society. My photograph is missing there. So I want to move on to West Africa. Numerous states were founded, expanded, and were maintained through conquest and warfare, for sure. Most of these included some amount of human labor exploitation, though before the era of the Atlantic slave trade, such exploitation, which is often referred to in English parlance as slavery, but which in all the various African languages have different names for whatever type of bondage it was, whether it was a child who was working off someone's debt, whether it was a person who had been captured in war, whether it was a grown person who was a pawn for debt. So there were different terms for the unfree labor of a person. But most of the time, whatever this kind of exploitation was not permanent, nor was it inheritable, nor did it lead to capital accumulation. These were usually domestic relationships where the people worked for a family. Sometimes, indeed, they became the family. So it wasn't the same kind of exploitative labor that we understand in the Atlantic, in the New World. So what about Mali? So most of what we know or understand about the Mali kingdom comes from the Epic of Sundiata, a long form poem which has been told since the 13th century, and the narrative of Ibn Battuta, who visited the kingdom in 1352, as well as the Egyptian chronicles. Mali takes the shape of a feudal kingdom after its founder, Sundiata, defeats and kills a rival king and convinces the leaders of many small states in the region to pledge loyalty to him and his dynasty. According to the legend, their loyalty is won through the force of his charismatic leadership, public oaths, vowing mutual support, and promises of regional glory. But certainly in factual terms, in this feudal structure, each vassal state maintained its own army, jurisdiction over its own peasants and lands, and provided yearly tribute to the central authority, mostly in the form of food, animals, and specialty crafts. Islam had been introduced into the region decades before, and it had been inconsistently practiced. But in the Mali kingdom, Islam, in many ways, functioned as a state religion. Nevertheless, earlier pre-Islamic religious practices were recognized, maintained, and supported by the state as well, thus ensuring the loyalty of the non-Islamic free peasant class. If leaders of vassal states became disgruntled as sometimes they did, they stopped paying tribute. Or if it was a period of active enforcement by the central authority, they left their homelands and migrated into other lands which the central government did not control. This image is an artistic depiction of the court of Mali, drawn from Ibn Batutta's eyewitness description. He describes the slave warriors of the king who protected the king with gold-tipped spears. And of course, my students often, we have to discuss that. How can you have armed slave warriors in the kingdom? But that was a pattern whereby these men, in this case men, were given privileges of all sorts for their service to the king. They weren't free in the neoliberal or liberal sense of a free person, but they were part of that structure within that kingdom. They had a role to play. They just were not free to go wherever they wanted to go. But it's been often discussed for Africa that freedom was the opposite. Freedom was not good in terms of being autonomous, where people prefer to be a part of a kinship group. That was how one had a role to play, was part of a kinship group. So that the opposite of slave was, the opposite of slave was kin, and a foreigner or foreign captive was not a part of the kin group as yet. So therefore their rights were restricted. So in general, in framing colonialism and imperialism in pre-modern Africa, one should bear in mind that over most of its thousands of years of human habitation, the continent has contained vastly more land than inhabitants, leading to an emphasis on wealth in people as a social value, and the option of migrating to new lands when a clan or family group was unhappy where they were. Genocide and the exploitation of people within a defined territory, hallmarks of settler colonialism, were neither possible nor desirable in pre-modern sub-Saharan Africa. However, the military superiority of rifles, rockets, machine guns made it possible by the late 19th century for Europeans and several pre-colonial states to formally impose settler colonialism on formerly independent African people. That did happen. It happened later, and some African people were involved in that, but it was in a much later period when there was a distinct technological superiority over others. But before that time, before the late industrial period or second industrial period, this kind of exploitation of land and people was not possible in sub-Saharan Africa. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Day. We're now going to move on to Hyunhee Park, who is a newly full professor of history at John Jay College and the CUNY Graduate Center. Take it away, Professor Park.
Okay, thank you, Professor Mancia. And hello, everyone. I'm Hyunhee Park. Thank you for inviting me to the Hess event with Professor Lowe. The invitation provides me with an excellent opportunity to think about possible forms of imperialism and colonialism in pre-modern Asia before 1492. In order to do so, first, I had to make sure of some conventional definitions of associated terms found in existing works. For example, definitions found in standard reference works such as the Encyclopedia Britannica. There, imperialism is defined as state policy, practice, or advocacy of extending power and dominion, especially by direct territorial acquisition, or by gaining political and economic control of other areas. Then it defines Western colonialism as a political economic phenomenon whereby various European nations explored, conquered, settled, and exploited large areas of the world. Basing myself in such conventional but still accepted understandings of imperialism and colonialism, I can now move to a discussion of the Chinese empires that emerged out of the first unification of the entire China proper after 221 before Common Era. and continued through several dynasties for 2 millennia. These empires yielded great political and cultural influence on other East Asian neighboring countries like Korea, Japan, and Vietnam through tributary relationships. We can find the sort of imperialism here, but it is a bit different from Western imperialism after 1492, because while neighboring countries acknowledged China's superiority and brought regular tribute, most dynasties in China did not attempt to invade such countries. Of course, there were a few occasions when Chinese dynasties invade other territories, such as the Sui dynasty, the Tang, but the Sui dynasty before the Tang dynasty tried to attempt to invade a state in northern Korea, Goguryeo, in the late 7th century. This ultimately failed. China also tried to control Vietnam's rich rice-growing region fully, but that led to a series of rebellions and Vietnamese independence. A powerful empire that arose in East Asia and changed the China-centered order there was that of the Mongols of the 13th and 14th centuries. The Mongols appeared under the leadership of Genghis Khan and began their massive expansion to every direction in Eurasia. They created the largest contiguous empire in world history, stretching from Hungary to the Pacific. They conquered China, Central Asia, the Islamic Empire, Russia, and other areas like Korea, and the descendants of Genghis Khan were assigned in major regions to rule. Can we define the Mongol Empire's policy and phenomenon as imperialism and colonialism? As for imperialism as defined in the encyclopedia, we can say yes. But as for colonialism, some scholars like Edward Said specify colonialism as referring to the implementing of settlements onto a distant territory, as we also discussed earlier. If we are bound to this definition, it's more complicated to view the phenomenon of the Mongol Empire as colonialism. It is true that the Mongol rulers brought their armies to several major conquered countries like China, Iran, and Russia, and exploited their resources. They even relocated many people in their empires to meet their needs. For example, they brought many craftsmen from other areas, including Europe, to their capital city in Mongolia to work for the Mongols. Nevertheless, the case of the Mongols is different from the case of Western colonialism in many ways. First of all, while the European countries justified controlling the colonized territories with the belief that they were far superior to the less civilized colonized people, the Mongols with nomadic origins were very open to other cultures and actively adopted and promoted unprecedented cross-cultural contacts and exchanges in Eurasia. In China, while trying to maintain their Mongol identity, a small number of the Mongol rulers also gradually adopted Chinese political systems and culture, such as the civil service exam based on Confucian classics. Some of the Mongol rulers in the conquered lands like Iran were considerably assimilated to the region's culture, even converting to the main local religion, Islam. Besides the major regions of Eurasia conquered by the Mongols, there are some other distant territories at the empire's margins that the Mongols dominated as colonies of sorts. A good example was the Goryeo dynasty in Korea here, existing from the 10th to the 14th century. It's easier for me to offer this case of Korea because I discussed it in my new book, Soju, A Global History. In my book, I argue that soju, a Korean distilled liquor spirit like vodka, was transferred from China under Mongol rule to Korea as a part of Korea's close political cultural exchanges. Korea serving as a kind of vassal state. Like many other regimes in Eurasia, Korea was first conquered by the Mongols and became part of the Mongol Empire. But the situation is more complex, as Korea was not just a vassal state. The Mongol conquest of Korea did not aim at the incorporation of Korea into the Mongol Empire, and instead sought only the kingdom's compliances as a vassal state. As a consequence, the Korea dynasty enjoyed de facto autonomy. Korea also raised its status in the Mongol Empire because its kings successfully advanced the status of their royal family by marrying Mongol royal princes and closely aligned the country with the giant neighbor. Here we also see marriage alliance. But the privileges enjoyed by the Korea royal family within the empire were gained through the exploitation and sacrifice of many commoners. The frequent supply of young women led to changes in Korea's social customs, indicated by such things as the rise of early marriage. The Mongols also asked considerable amount of goods from Korea as tribute. But again, the Mongols promoted an unprecedented flow of people, goods, and ideas across their vast empire, and the people in Korea also benefited. For example, through Korea's connection to the Yuan in China and to the wider Eurasian world, the Koreans adopted distilled spirits like soju, which had developed and rapidly spread under the Mongols. Along with soju, many other items such as meat dishes, and soup dishes, ideas like Neo-Confucianism, astronomical and geographical and medical knowledge, including that from West Asia, were also transferred to Korea, exchanged and localized in an innovative way. But the continuous exploitation of the Mongols led to the last Korea kings to expel the Mongols, and they cooperated with the Ming dynasty that replaced the Mongol dynasty in China in the 14th century. The new dynasty in Korea returned to the tributary relationship which had existed with other Chinese dynasties. In China, the native Ming dynasty tried to repudiate the foreign influences that the Chinese had incorporated during the Mongol rule, but they received also a lot of the Mongol legacy, such as unupdated political, social, and economic systems, as well as scientific and technological achievements. We can see this legacy in the famous Zheng He voyages to West Asia and the East African coast, unprecedented official ventures that were also based on the earlier legacy of maritime exchanges. The main purpose of the Ming voyages was to project China's political power to the foreign countries in the Indian Ocean and not to colonize them. Even so, the voyages came to a complete close after the death of the emperor and the Admiral Zheng He in the early 15th century. And the Chinese made no further use of this legacy. Their failure to do so contrasts starkly with the later European explorers. So in my conclusion, we can see some similarities, but also many differences in the cases of colonialism in pre-modern East Asia and modern Europe. This is a good place to start my talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Park. Now, last but not least, we will hear from Professor Jason Frydman, Associate Professor of English at Brooklyn College.
Thank you, everybody. I'd like to begin by thanking Professor Lauren Mancia for inviting me to join this panel, Professor Rosamund King for overseeing the Hess Scholar in Residence program through her stellar leadership of the Wolf Institute, Anthony Blanco for handling the logistics, making this event possible, and finally, Professor Lisa Lowe for so graciously accepting our invitation to be with us this week at Brooklyn College. My talk today will traverse continents and an ocean, reaching from Persia and India through Africa, across the Atlantic to the New World. I will try to draw a line from the golden age of Islamic empire to the misery of chattel slavery on plantations in Maryland, Mississippi, and Jamaica. In particular, I will track how elements of Abbasid court culture in 8th and 9th century Baghdad worked their way into the archive of transatlantic slavery. The Abbasid dynasty moved the capital of the caliphate to Baghdad. By this time, Islam had become the dominant religion in the land stretching from the west of the Indian subcontinent, Persia, Iraq, the Levant, Egypt, North Africa, Al-Andalus, and the West African Sahel. Across these lands, Islam established a common legal framework and secure routes of trade and travel, leading to considerable prosperity and cultural and scientific exchange. Historians remark upon the ethos of mobility underwritten by early Islamic empire, when travel for trade, pilgrimage, adventure, and knowledge was alluring and available, entailing cities from Fez and Cordoba to Cairo and Baghdad, as well as the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. The Abbasid court avidly assimilated non-Arab traditions, especially the courtly traditions of Persia and India. For our purposes here today, I will focus on one aspect of this courtly culture, which is the prominent role of the ulama and the udibet, the learned sages, jurists, geographers, historians, grammarians, scientists, rhetoricians, and poets gathered around the caliph's court. The Abbasids placed particular value on adab, a concept helpfully glossed in a text relevant to my talk today, The 1001 Nights. In the prologue to this compendium of tales, enshrined and propelled throughout the Islamic world during the Abbasid period and beyond, we meet the inimitable narrator, Scheherazade. Shahrazad had read the books of literature, philosophy, and medicine. She knew poetry by heart, had studied historical reports, and was acquainted with the sayings of men and the maxims of sages and kings. She was intelligent, knowledgeable, and wise. She was refined. She had read and learned. Adab, then, connotes not only knowledge, but a particular form of comportment and etiquette, the proper way of mobilizing this knowledge with refinement at court. In the same way that the Abbasid court in Baghdad assimilated elements of Indian, Persian, and Byzantine courtly culture, throughout Dar al-Islam, local courts emulated the court of the caliphs Mansur, Harun al-Rashid, and al-Mamun. This emulation was fueled and informed by the remarkable culture of mobility in the early Islamic period. As pilgrims, traders, and scholars traveled from one end of the Ummah to the other, they carried with them manuscripts and oral traditions, weaving a common medium of ilm, the Islamic sciences, adab, and popular storytelling, in which were represented and encoded models of Abbasid courtly culture, increasingly enshrined as an idealized form of governance. Harun al-Rashid himself, his Nadim or companion, the poet Abu Nuwas, and the vizier Jafar entered the lore of the 1001 Nights within one generation of his rule, disguising themselves as commoners and mixing with the residents of the city, getting entangled in all sorts of marvelous, comical, and often lascivious episodes that ultimately reward justice, wisdom, and ingenuity while punishing wickedness and deceit. These tales fashion Harun al-Rashid as a wondrous ruler of Baghdad's golden age. Wars of conquest and dynastic succession played a role in creating the conditions that enabled the weaving of a common legal, narrative, and spiritual medium in this period of early Islamic empire. Yet no army crossed the Sahara to establish Islam in West Africa. The reach of the courtly ulama exceeded the reach of state rule. Muslim traders extended their relations from the Maghreb across the Sahel and established residency in the regions now encompassing Senegal, Ghana, Nigeria, Niger, and Mali. Through their alluring difference, their success, their connection to a wider cosmopolitan world of wealth, power, prestige, and faith, these small mercantile beachheads of Islam drew many individuals, then families, then communities, then polities into their fold. In this period before 1100, historians refer to the peaceful persuasion that itinerant traders, scholars, and chroniclers exercised over local populations, who increasingly saw the advantages of joining the Ummah. By the 11th century, these West African communities had assimilated Arab Islamic culture into social and governmental structures, and they replicated the model offered by the Abbasid court in Baghdad, extending patronage to the ulama and udibat. This involved sponsoring scholars' travels to centers of learning as nearby as Morocco and Al-Andalus, and as far afield as Cairo and Baghdad. Received as honored guests of courts across the Islamic world, these figures brought back firsthand knowledge of courtly culture, as well as manuscripts and oral performances. These would then be unfolded into local courts, religious schools, and centers of study, such as Timbuktu and Janneh, further tightening the shared medium of early Islamic courtly culture. Similarly, the extensive trade networks governed by Islamic law were also sites of narrative exchange, particularly for the Maqamat of al-Hariri and the 1001 Nights, which is often thought of as the edeb of the marketplace, giving prominent place to merchants and sailors. Tales from the Nights, already mixed with those hailing from India, Persia, and Greece, further mixed with local Anansi traditions, enlarging that foundational sea of stories famously rooted in the Indian Ocean world. By the time the transatlantic slave trade began capturing West Africans and transporting them to the New World, Abbasid court culture firmly represented an idealized moment of Islamic society, a golden age that was sedimented deep into the textual, narrative, religious, and political culture of West African Muslim polities. This deep sedimentation of the edeb of pre-modern Islamic empire constituted the bedrock of Arab Islamic culture, carried by captives such as Job ben Solomon to Maryland, Prince Abdurrahman to Mississippi, Abu Bakr as-Siddiq of Timbuktu to Jamaica, and the Mandingo Society of Port of Spain, Trinidad. These African Muslims hailed from courts of Futa Jalon and Futa Toro, from Timbuktu and Janneh. Job ben Solomon was actually received at court in England, and by accounts that survive, proved so adept at wooing his listeners with suspenseful tales worthy of Shahrazad and geographic knowledge that he was repatriated from bondage and given a mercantile position in the Royal African Company. The Mandingo Society of Port of Spain conducted a courtly correspondence with King George IV and Queen Victoria, mobilizing classical Islamic jurisprudence to petition for the repatriation. It was denied. In 1807, the Irish doctor John Coates Cox stumbled upon and recognized Prince Abdurrahman Sori from the Royal House of Sori in Futa Jalon, enslaved on a Natchez, Mississippi plantation. As this royal family had saved Dr. Cox's life during a voyage to Futa Jalon in 1781, he plotted for Abdurrahman's manumission, and it was supported by the Secretary of State Henry Clay, who mistook him for a Moroccan rather than Fulbe prince, and wanted to avoid trouble with the Ottoman Bey of Tunis. This ultimately found Abdurrahman donning an orientalized costume of Moroccan courtly elegance as he traveled the United States, raising money for the repatriation of himself and his American-born family to West Africa. In 1834, Abu Bakr as-Siddiq of Timbuktu presented the British official Sir Richard Madden in Jamaica, where he had been enslaved, with a courtly chronicle modeled after the classical Sirah genre of the exemplary life story, which detailed his royal lineage and his learned status. He petitioned successfully for repatriation and joined John Davidson's expedition to Timbuktu as a guide and escort. Despite the efforts of Madden and other British officials to maintain contact with as-Siddiq, he vanished soon after this expedition, ghosting himself from his erstwhile acquaintances for reasons we can only speculate about. The speeches, letters, and narratives of these courtly figures, adorned with literary, scientific, and juridical learning, bring apparitions of the Abbasid Empire into the archive of transatlantic slavery. And here, reflecting on the idea of pre-modern colonialisms and empire before 1492, I think I would just leave off with some speculative questions about these apparitions that cross historical time zones, from the so-called pre-modern to the modern. What is it to imagine traces of Abbasid court culture in the tobacco, cotton, and sugar plantations of the Americas? What does it mean about the durability of imperial status in the face of racial capitalism and settler colonialism, such that the British Empire recognized these Muslim Africans' difference, their affiliation with Islamic empires past and present? Questions for further research, I suppose. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you so much. So we're going to turn now to a very brief response by Professor Lowe, and then we're going to open the floor for questions. But first, Professor Lowe.
Thank you. I'm so pleased and honored to respond to these fascinating papers, which for somebody like myself, who really is a scholar of modern culture, it just is it deepens my understanding of colonialism and empire in the ancient pre-modern world, and provides a rich set of historical examples, precisely because of their differences from modern definitions, urging those of us who are modernists to reflect upon the ways that our modern studies not only tend to rely upon the nation state and national units of culture and society, but also somewhat haphazardly universalize or extend our modern notions of settler colonialism and empire to circumstances that are really quite different. So I really appreciated the ways in which all of the papers took care to redefine these terms for how they should be used in the ancient world. From the papers, we also learned that global connections are certainly not new, that so-called globalization is not exclusively relevant to late modernity. Rather, all of the papers highlight these processes that have linked multiple spaces over the longer course of world history. And in the ancient world, there were empires, conquests, slavery, trade, diasporas. So in that sense, their papers provincialize modern Europe and demonstrate that European colonial expansion from the 16th century to its heights in the 19th is really a relatively recent and short phenomenon. Global processes have, of course, varied in time and location and have taken place quite differently in unlike parts of the world. So these fascinating papers suggest alternative research models for understanding the longer history of contacts, encounters, and exchanges across the world, which really go beyond the modern study of cultures as bounded nations analogous to one another. Of course, implicit in this is that even the concept of nation is a modern, really is from the 18th century onward. So as someone who works on the 18th century onward, these papers really remind me of the pitfalls of what we call presentism. And I think not, so many, we're all so vulnerable to this. And of course, the British literary critic Raymond Williams reminded us that it's really not until the 19th century that culture even comes to mean what we take it to mean, which is civilization or aesthetic cultivation. And the German philosopher Herder wrote of culture, quote, nothing is more deceptive than the application of culture to all nations and periods, unquote. So if we too hastily extend modern concepts of culture to the interpretation of earlier periods and to all locations, we risk doing real violence to the broader heterogeneous landscape of relationships within and from, more specifically, modern forms emerged. Professor Sowers' paper on the ancient Mediterranean unsettles our modern geographic presumption of regions, areas, and fields. And it was very impressive that the ways in which all panelists showed maps of areas and geographies that in the modern period we think we know as Europe, the Middle East, North Africa. And it helps us to see that these modern regional divisions are only recent and that they're most often informed by colonial and Cold War priorities. And that they aren't separate and bounded, of course, but in the ancient world, really very dynamically related. Professor Sowers' complex portrait of the Phoenician, Greek, and Roman empires also suggests that Europe was hardly homogeneous as the nation states in Europe tend to represent themselves, but they really emerged at the intersection of contacts and exchanges among very different kinds of people, most likely including Africans, Arabs, Asians, as well as Christians, Muslims, and Jews. Professor Lynda Day's paper provides a complex and revealing portrait of Bantu expansion into Central, Southern, and Eastern Africa, as well as the pre-modern empire of Mali and West Africa. And this too displaces present day understandings of Africa, and particularly its division into states that really are from the colonial period or the anti-colonial period of independence or decolonizing period of independence. So this earlier history unmoors our presentist modern spatial understandings, again, most of which date to colonial and Cold War periods. Likewise, Professor Park's presentation on pre-modern imperialism and the Sui and Tang dynasties helps us to reconceive the East Asia area as it's been configured within modern East Asian studies, suggesting that China cannot be treated as a discrete history and culture, and emphasizing instead connections and contacts between Europe, China, and the Islamic world. And her fascinating work on Soju points to very early inter-Asia contact for cultural and technological transfers and exchanges. Professor Frydman's exciting paper on medieval Islamic trade routes helps us to displace our very limited modern ways of conceptualizing the quote unquote Middle East. The Middle East itself, a very colonial name, east of what, middle of what. Not only does he discuss the remarkable knowledge and culture of the medieval Islamic court, but we understand that there were extensive cross-regional Arabic aesthetic, religious, and cultural exchanges, not only across the Mediterranean world, but in what becomes West Africa. So by the time of transatlantic slavery, West African peoples had adopted and indeed perhaps indigenized Islam. And some of these West Africans were captured and enslaved in the Americas, though Professor Frydman describes several very interesting cases of West Africans who were then repatriated when their backgrounds were discovered. In conclusion, all of the papers on the pre-modern world reveal the importance of not simply directly or haphazardly applying modern ideas of settler colonialism and empire to the ancient world, but rather taking analytic terms, concepts, and spatial terms from those of their ancient uses themselves. Thank you.
Professor Lowe, thank you. That was a masterful response. And I think I'm going to start using it in my sort of ploy to recruit students and reteach what pre-modernity is. Pre-modernists are unmooring presentism and provincializing modern Europe. I love it. It's great. All of us smiled when you said that. It was fantastic.
But it's true.
So, all right, we're going to open the floor to everybody in the audience, which includes a lot of students in pre-modern classes and students who are studying the sort of inheritance of the pre-modern phenomena that we've discussed today. So if you have a connection to something you've studied, if something you studied is missing from this cornucopia of knowledge that we've put in front of you that you want to contribute, I'm thinking of my medieval Christianity students, hint, hint. We haven't talked about Christianity at all, really, here. So if you got any ideas about how that contributes to settler colonialism, game to hear. But anybody with any connections, there are also a bunch of pre-modern faculty, pre-modernist faculty in the audience. They're not from the pre-modern age, although some of them might feel like it in the Zoom universe. No, come on. What do we got? I know we've got things, we've got ideas. Anyone converted or not converted? Anyone see sort of the genocide and the forced assimilation still in these portraits of pre-modern colonialism? Constantine conquering Rome, Jacqueline, awesome. Cool, Christianity spreading, I like these ideas. Does anyone have any questions or comments? Jacqueline, do you want to unmute and say anything? One of the things that, oh, great. Anwar has a question. Why don't we have a set definition of colonialism? Great, that's open to the panel. Why can't we just give a stamp to the Encyclopedia Britannica and say, this is it?
So so when I try to find the definitions about colonialism, so I started Britannica, but I look at some other, but the Britannica only gives a definition for Western colonialism. So that was interesting. But imperialism is just imperialism. And then, so does it mean that, so already many scholars realize there are diversity about this. And so maybe it's time to add more ideas about more diverse colonialism, at least about this colonialism. Yeah, that was interesting, like how people even distinguish imperialism and colonialism and this.
I have oh yeah, Professor Frydman, go for it.
Oh, yeah, I was just thinking about how even in our kind of contemporary modern languages, the word is a very fluid word. In Spanish, for example, colonia is a common word for a neighborhood, right? In Mexico City, Colonia Roma, right? Whereas in French, colon is the word they use for settlements in the occupied territories of Palestine. And you can just see there is, even in the kind of everyday usage, what it means to have a colony. Everything from just this ethnically specific neighborhood to that kind of classic model of a militarized, a settler colonial enterprise. And the etymology itself has a history. And once that history kind of gets complex, it makes it impossible to kind of bind, I guess, a kind of singular monolithic, to use a word that Professor Lowe dropped in the chat, kind of singular definition.
Professor Sowers.
Yeah, I kind of want to maybe ask a related question, which kind of came to mind after Professor Lowe responded to our collective talks. And that has to do with, I kind of wondered as I was taking notes, I started to notice that there was like recurring features. So one of them was the assimilation of culture, the ways in which power oftentimes can adopt the culture of spaces that it is either overtly controlling or tacitly controlling. I noticed also that we were talking about intermarriage, and then as I was listening to our talks, I started to make direct connections with Alexander the Great intentionally engaging in an intermarriage program, the assimilation of especially Egyptian culture by the Ptolemaic colonizers. So much so that when the Romans try to conquer Cleopatra, who is Greek, they describe her as Egyptian. And I kind of wonder if some of this is can be used as a way of like distinguishing pre-modern colonialisms, these practices, from the shadow of like modern European colonialisms, in a way that I kind of wonder, this is sort of an open-ended question, in a way that can actually erase the actual experiences of the indigenous peoples at the time. So despite the fact, to be really quite direct, and I'll use the context that I know of, despite the fact that the Ptolemaic colonizers in Egypt are writing in Egyptian hieroglyphics, they are using all of the cultural features of Egyptian society, they have created a hierarchy of supremacy. And we see that because we have the records to see that they are really sort of subjugating the indigenous Egyptian peoples. And I kind of wonder if some of that can be lost in the attempts to sort of distinguish the pre-modern from the modern, the lived experiences of indigenous people yeah.
There's a question in the chat about the use of how the powerful elites rewrite history. and to put their own to put their hegemony in a positive light. And certainly that has happened, as we know, in written formats. But I did want to point out that in pre-modern Africa, where nowadays we often only know of some of these events through oral tradition, that those oral traditions probably have been constructed in such a way as to make the dominant power look good. So I certainly would want to take it into consideration when looking, for example, at the story of the Hutu, Tutsi, and Twa people, how it looked before the Belgians and the Germans got there. But that, yes, when their story is legendary, and many stories are legendary, about the hunter who came from the forest, who then married the current king's daughter, and then it was kind of like, and then we lived happily ever after. But it's not likely that it was quite exactly that way. So I did want to just mention that.
I mean, there are several questions actually in the chat about sources, about how we can read sources without the sort of obfuscation of modernity, without the sort of the blinder of modernity and presentism. And then there's another question about the relationship between orality and literacy in evolving colonial projects in history. So we can sort of pull all of these questions together. If anyone has any responses to any of them. Yeah, Professor Lowe.
I'm still thinking about Professor Sowers' spontaneous response to the similarities of even across centuries and centuries. And I guess, and then also thinking about the original question of why don't we have a single definition of colonialism? I mean, I guess my response would be, it's good not to, but also I can see why it's important to be able to identify some similarities. And I would just say that in the modern period, even colonialism is so varied, and of course depends opportunistically on what the colonial administrators find in the locations that they're colonizing. So in certain cases, the colonizer wants to educate, force everybody to speak their language and educate them in the ways of their culture, religion, society, administration. In others, it rests on excluding the colonized from civilization and not teaching them language, in order to better extract or to seize land, or et cetera. So even within the modern period, I think it's very important to stress that there's lots of different, colonialism isn't monolithic, and there are lots of different ways, but it's fascinating the way certain kinds of tactics repeat themselves. Certain brute plunder to, forced assimilation, you can notice over and over again.
Julissa, I'm going to let you ask your question, and then the panelists can answer any of the questions that are in the ether. Go for it, Julissa.
Perfect. Hi, can you hear me? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Good morning. Just trying to add up to what Professor Lowe just mentioned in regards to colonialism and how the elites are the ones actually in charge of, I guess, having a dynasty of their history analyzed through different eyes. I believe that it's done so in a way that they felt that it was their calling to colonize this, as they will call it, barbaric tribes, uncivilized tribes that needed either Christianity or needed a language or needed to be, in a sense, involved in a civilization or society that didn't actually allow them to do so, because they were so far behind in society that in order for them to even have a thought of being involved in a system of either economics, either in politics, in their own tribes, that they needed the outsiders to actually show them how to live and how to actually perform different tasks when it came to even just like moving from one place to the other, you know, actually getting the knowledge of how to interact with others. And it's interesting how everything is always done through other people's eyes, you know, like I forgot the other lady that just mentioned about the elites. I'm sorry. And it's true, like those are actually the winners are the ones that are writing history, you know, putting aside everybody else's struggles. Because we don't have, well, at least I don't know, I haven't read any books in which it details the history of others, you know, and it's always books about Constantine, books about Alexander, books about Cleopatra, you know, everything that they have done. But, you know, no one says, you know, a book about whomever in which they struggle as much as everybody else did. And their history, not that it's forgotten, but it's just that it's not in depth described and analyzed. So.
Professor Day.
Hi, I just wanted to make the point that even where the ideology is that we've come to help them or something, a lot of colonizing really has to do with the desire to exploit existing resources. They know that resources are there, that's why they go there. And specifically in the case of colonization in settler places in Africa, they went to control existing trade routes that were already operational and that were already bringing resources out, but they wanted to control them. So don't get caught up in this, we want to help them rhetoric. The colonizing efforts are typically for knowledge and conscious exploitation of existing wealth and riches. That's all I want to say.
Professor Sowers.
Yeah, Julissa, thank you for that question. It's awesome. When you were talking, I immediately flagged a couple of words. One of which is the word barbarian, which is a word that originates in Greek. It's a loaded term. I kind of want to go back to a point that I had said earlier, which is the way in which the shadow of modern colonialisms can distort and fragment our understanding of the ancient world. I want to sort of problematize this just with one specific example. So the Greeks are engaged in this colonizing program, but they're not doing this with cultures that they view as backwards. They don't view them as needing language, as needing literature. In fact, the Greeks have borrowed the art that they have from the Egyptians. They've borrowed literature from Mesopotamia. So these are old-timey venerated traditions, and at the same time, they're using the language that these are barbarian, which just simply means that they don't speak our language. But that gets complicated in the ancient world, where they're not trying to necessarily say, like, you don't have these things, so we're going to give them to you. As Professor Day says, you have a whole bunch of resources because of the Nile or because of the Tigris and Euphrates, and we want those. And that sort of clarifies it, even when they're using the rhetoric of cultural superiority, and they are very much using that rhetoric.
Can I quickly?
Yeah.
So, yes, about the discussion about the term barbarian, it really, there's a huge discussion, and I cannot even summarize it now, but the Mongols were the barbarians from the Chinese views, but they suddenly rose and they conquered, and the Mongols are the first foreigners who conquered entire China. But they didn't have a writing system. So they actively adopted the writing system and they created their own. But still, because they didn't leave many documents as other neighbors like Chinese, there have been a lot of kind of prejudice. And then because scholars cannot use those documents. And so, for example, the Chinese documents describe them as really barbaric and like demons. In some like animation portray them, but from the archaeological evidence, we see they themselves portray them as like nice guys. So always there are issues about how to interpret these sources. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we have to close the panel right now so you can all get to the next panel on the new nativism at 11 a.m. But before we do, let's give our panelists a round of applause. And also, I just want to say that obviously we cannot dig into these issues in this panel in an hour and 15 minutes. And I promise you that the digging is very satisfying if you take a class in any of these areas with any of these professors or anybody else on the faculty of your school. So thanks so much for being here. See you in the next Zoom room in 15 minutes and at Professor Lowe's talk tonight on the colonial present. So thanks so much, everyone. Take care.